Okay, welcome everyone. We are live. Thank you guys for joining us. My name is Ali Minigakis, and I am the founder of South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. That's SC for CJR. And we are so excited and honored to have with us Dr. Edward Lawson Jr. today. I'm going to be introducing him shortly. Of course, I'm joined again by my illustrious co-host, Tola Familoni, who is on the executive board of SC for CJR. And we're very excited to have our other executive board member today, Keith Smalls. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As I always do, I just want to tell you all a little bit about South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. We are a 100% grassroots, nonpartisan organization. We're dedicated to holistic criminal justice reform in South Carolina. Our goal is to make sure that each stage of the criminal justice system is fair, equal, and just for all parties. We don't take any funding at this time. Therefore, we depend 100% on grassroots volunteers just like you. Our team is composed of criminal justice reform advocates from diverse backgrounds, including criminal defense attorneys like Tola and myself, public defenders, former prosecutors, academics, formerly incarcerated individuals like our executive board member here, Keith Smalls, and others, academics and others who are passionate about criminal justice reform in our state. Our motto is fairness, awareness, and change, and we are dedicated to unveiling the injustices throughout each stage of the criminal justice system. Our goal is to educate people on these injustices, research and interview experts on possible solutions to these injustices, just like we are today, and research and come up with creative proposals and solutions to these injustices and push for legislative reform. So today we are here for our fourth episode of Dissecting Police Problems and Solutions. Today we are focusing on police militarization, and we are so honored to be joined today by Dr. Edward Lawson Jr. Dr. Lawson is a data scientist and seasoned researcher, specifically in the areas of race, criminal justice, and bureaucratic systems. After receiving his doctorate in political science from the University of South Carolina, Dr. Lawson worked as an adjunct professor, a researcher, and now as a data analytics consultant for the South Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. Throughout his time as a data analyst, Dr. Lawson has published research articles in scientific journals, many including Political Research Quarterly, and focused his dissertation on studying the use of lethal force, police militarization, and the effects of such on American society. We are so grateful to have you, Dr. Lawson. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Can you tell us, Dr. Lawson, just a little bit about your research and what things you think are important that maybe people don't know about the police system, whether it's militarization, lethal force, or anything that you really researched?
Sure. So my dissertation was called The Causes and Consequences of Police Militarization. And essentially the way it sort of flowed was first I looked at what causes police militarization, specifically looking at racial demographics. And I find that actually as local populations, say cities, counties, and such, as they become proportionally more Black or Latino, police become more militarized up until they hit a certain critical mass point where that relationship reverses and police become less militarized. The next part was the article that was published in Political Research Quarterly, which finds that as police become more militarized, they kill more civilians, controlling for lots of other factors that I can talk about later if anyone's interested. And lastly, I looked at how do police killings affect police department responses as far as policy due to backlash from those killings. I specifically looked at a 2015 Justice Department program where police departments could request funding for implementing or expanding body camera programs. And I find that police departments that killed more people previously in 2014 were more likely to apply for and more likely to receive grants for body camera programs in 2015. But then those police departments also then killed more people in 2016. So there obviously lots of implications for that for research into policies like body cameras, research into the effects of militarization and what causes it and such. Happy to talk about any kind of details of that if anyone's interested as well. I also just published an article in a journal called Politics, Groups, and Identities with co-author Ryan Strickler, who is an assistant professor at Colorado State Pueblo. It's called Racial Conservatism, Self-Monitoring, and Perceptions of Police Violence. We did a survey where we show a fake news article about a police shooting. Some people got just the article. Some people got pictures, and of those that got pictures, some of them got a black officer and a white suspect that was killed. Some of them got the opposite. We found in that survey project that this was a way to try to study how people react and how people could see the same incident and come at it from two different directions. So we actually find that whites are actually less likely to say a police shooting is justified if it explicitly involves a white officer and a black victim. We look at things like self-monitoring and racial conservatism. The whites that show higher ratings of racial conservatism are more likely to say that shooting is justified, and those that score higher on self-monitoring scales are less likely to say it's justified. Unfortunately, I have left active research for the most part now. I've left academia and I'm working in state government doing data analytics now. But this is the work that I did before leaving. I'm happy to talk about it today and happy to be here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lawson. I'll call you Eddie from here on out.
Please do.
So let's just start from the beginning, I suppose. How did our police reach this mindset, this militaristic mindset? Obviously, that wasn't always their function in society. So when did this evolution first occur?
There's no real one time that we can pinpoint to say this is when police became militarized. It's been sort of an ongoing process. I think and I argue in my dissertation too, that it starts really in the 1960s. We have the rise of law and order politics, and we have the advent of the war on drugs and the war on crime. For some reason, Americans really like war metaphors. I'm not really sure why that is. But we had the rise of the war on crime, the war on drugs, law and order politics. And so what we get from that is a flood of resources into policing, right? So we're declaring a war on drugs now. It's hard to get drugs off the street. They're easy to come in, easy to hide, so it's hard to get to them. So there's, in support of these wars now, we have this flood of resources, financial, personnel, equipment, all sorts of things that police departments did not really previously have access to. We have the rise of SWAT teams and other such entities like that, and that sort of provided the I guess financial base of police militarization, and it provided the rhetoric of it. You have this war rhetoric, right? We're soldiers, we're fighting this enemy in our streets on this front line, and getting away sort of from the rhetoric of protection or public service or guardian, and getting into this more violent militaristic war type of rhetoric. And so now we have the financial resources. Of course, when the war on drugs comes about, a lot of the neighborhoods that are being targeted are minority. And we also see a theory called broken windows. And just to give you the broken windows theory in a nutshell, this is the idea that any sign of disorder, no matter how small, like a broken window in a neighborhood or a city, if it's not fixed quickly, it will eventually lead to greater signs of disorder. So small crimes, if they're not checked, will eventually lead to greater crimes. And eventually what we have is city collapse, so to speak. And that's the theoretical argument behind this. And so the idea was, if you flood so-called high crime neighborhoods, crime hotspots, so to speak, flood those with police officers and harshly punish any infraction you can find from jaywalking on up, and then you get rid of all of the small signs of disorder in the neighborhood, and then you send in social welfare programs and you send in resources to help build those neighborhoods up, so help people start businesses, find jobs and such. Then you can rescue these neighborhoods. What ended up happening historically, though, was we got the flood of police on the streets, but we did not really get the flood of social welfare programs. And with the injection of resources we got from the wars on crimes, war on drugs, the war on terror now, most recently, plus that gave the resources, the financing for militarization. Broken windows policing, I think, gave the theoretical and the operational strategies of broken windows policing, because now you don't have so much of police officers walking a beat and getting to know their neighborhood. You don't have the Carl Winslows anymore. I've been watching a lot of Family Matters with my son lately, so that's on my mind. But you don't get a lot of Carl Winslows anymore walking a beat and getting to know their neighborhood that they're supposed to be patrolling. You have police going from hotspot to hotspot, flooding these areas with officers and locking people up for relatively small, petty crimes. And so now you have the building tension between the population in these neighborhoods and the police, to where the population doesn't see the same police officer walking their beat every day anymore. They see a bunch of police officers in body armor and assault weapons charging into their neighborhood and flooding it and arresting people they know for really not necessarily doing anything. And so you have that divide creating now, and you have police acting more like an occupying army rather than public service.
I think it's interesting, to use the term occupying army, because it seems like there's a disconnect between, the rules that our actual military needs to follow when they're engaged in any type of combat, and what our militarized police are using when they're, walking the streets. For example, our protesters in the use of tear gas. Could you go into, the differences there?
I can't speak much to military rules because I've never been in the military. I do know there are certain rules of engagement that say when you can and cannot fire on someone. I know that chemical weapons are banned by the Geneva Convention, and tear gas is considered a chemical weapon. So I can speak to those for sure. And police may or may not have, or most likely have, regulations as to when they're allowed to shoot, but they're also fairly broadly interpreted, it seems. And even if they're violated, it's incredibly difficult to actually prosecute a police officer for killing anyone or for shooting anyone.
And why do you think that is? I mean, it seems like a serious issue that will require more from our military abroad than we do from our police officers domestically.
I think people sort of they sort of give a certain credibility to police officers, and a lot of that's what we've been taught to believe. We've seen Carl Winslow on TV, we've seen Cops, and we've seen Live PD, and we've seen insert any other show about police officers here, where they're portrayed as being heroes, and so it's not a universal thing. We can't say universally that police are heroes. They're people, and they don't always have the best motivations, just like anybody else. But we've been taught to believe that police don't do anything wrong, and so we've been taught to believe that if police shoot someone, then it was probably justified, right? Even if we don't know, we weren't there, we didn't see the incident happen, the only witnesses to it are the police officer that did the shooting and the dead person. The police probably feared for their life, or the person probably went for the police officer's gun, or the person did something to deserve being shot or to justify the police officer in shooting them. So I think it's a matter of the public giving them this credibility and the benefit of the doubt.
And of course, there definitely are police officers that are heroes, right?
Sure, I've known some of them.
Right, just like all different kinds of careers, and we respect them. But I guess what you're saying is that there is this general assumption for all police officers by a lot of people that we should take their word for it or assume that they are doing the right thing just because they are police officers.
Right, and it's an assumption without any question. It's almost like lots of people just don't think it's possible for a police officer to do anything wrong, and I think that's kind of dangerous. Anyone in any profession can do something wrong, even if they don't intend to, even if it was accidental, even if they don't actually have malicious intent. Someone can do something wrong in whatever job they have. Coming from academia, professors aren't perfect, but I don't think professors get the kind of automatic presumption of zero wrongdoing that police officers get.
I mean, and that reminds me, of a term that you hear frequently in law school, and obviously it's not isolated just to law school, but it's slippery slope, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the level at which it seems society wants to empower police officers is removing that check, that self-check, or, that societal check of, are you actually doing everything the way you're supposed to be doing them? Or are we giving you too much power by assuming that no matter what you do, it's correct? How do we correct that general mindset of the police? Because either they're not heroes, because obviously their job is incredibly dangerous, and many of them are doing things on a day-to-day basis that are risking their very lives. But we also want to make sure that they're navigating themselves among the community that is safe for everybody. How do we make sure that we're, I guess, not being still like a watchdog, but checking their actions?
Sure. So as far as danger, of course, yeah, being a police officer is more dangerous than lots of other jobs. It's also not quite as dangerous as some people might think it is. Being a garbage collector statistically is actually more dangerous than being a police officer. But it's not taking away from police. It is a dangerous job that they're being asked to do. I think, and this sort of goes into my dissertation chapter that looks into body cameras, because after the Michael Brown shooting, which was what inspired me to sort of go into this line of research, there was a push for body cameras. That's why that Justice Department grant program was created. There was this push for body cameras, as if, and it makes a lot of sense, really, if you just sort of see it on the surface, is that, okay, we have a little camera, it's stuck right there on the police officer, so it's going to record everything they're looking at. And so they'll download the video at the end of the shift, and we'll be able to see if there's a question as to whether a police officer did something wrong or not. Pull up the video and let's watch and see what happened. It turns out it doesn't really work that way. Lots of police departments actually their policies prohibit body camera video from being used for disciplinary or performance review purposes. They can essentially only use video footage as evidence against someone else of a crime. So the recorded evidence of the suspect the officer's looking at, they can use it for evidence against that person in a crime, but they cannot be used as any kind of disciplinary mechanism against the police officers. And it's really hard to get to. We might not think that, because recent incidents where there's body camera footage, it gets released eventually, but it's really difficult to get access to body camera video for just the general public, even if you're in the video. So I think one step is a more credible mechanism of oversight. If it was easier for the public to see that police are doing their jobs correctly. And so I think oversight, putting a little more teeth into policies like body cameras, would probably be helpful. But really, with the case of militarization and use of excessive force, I think a lot of it goes back to training. It goes back to the way police are trained. And I think in a previous episode of this, you had Seth Stoughton, who's a former colleague of mine at University of South Carolina. He's in the law school there. And he's written some really great work about this law enforcement's warrior problem. And he writes about it being really a matter of training, that police are being taught that everyone around them is trying to kill them. And at any point, they could, someone could pull out a gun and shoot them, or they could be harmed at any point. And, you see it if you watch a show like Live PD. You hear more than once police officers say something to the effect of, well, if it's him or me, I'm going home to see my family tonight. And there's just this ingrained sense of fear of everyone. And that sort of also goes back to the war metaphor, where they're an occupying army. They don't know who the enemy is. Everyone around them looks the same, and so they're taught to just suspect that everyone is the enemy, unless it is conclusively proven otherwise. So I think really it goes back to a matter of training before we even get to the oversight stage.
I think that segues nicely into this topic of defund the police? Because if now we're arguing that we need to put a stronger emphasis on training, but we're also saying that we should take money away from, police organizations in general and divert it elsewhere. How do we walk that line?
Finance and stuff isn't something I looked into a whole lot. I looked up some stuff about police department budgets, as far as using it as control variables and such. I couldn't tell you specifically where to take money from and where to put it. I know a lot of people are going to say take the funding away from military equipment. A lot of police departments are using the federal 1033 program that's gotten a lot of press in the last few years, really since the Michael Brown shooting. But all that equipment is free. Congress is paying for that, and it's sitting in a warehouse somewhere until the police go on the internet and pick it. And they say, I want that. So taking away military equipment, I think, is also something that we should do, and ending the 1033 program is something we should do, but it's not really going to affect funding in a sense. But as far as, where do we specifically take away from, I don't really think I can speak to that, just because I haven't done the work of individual police budgets to be able to speak to it.
Dr. Lawson,
Yes.
I just have a quick question. I want to go back to the training aspect of it. How do you feel about former President Barack Obama's task force on 21st century policing? I heard a lot of good things about it. As it traveled around the country, the law enforcement and helping to retrain officers. What is your opinion of that task force and some of the things?
I know it existed. I know, I'm not sure if it was associated with the COPS program, the community-oriented policing, maybe service, but it was a grant-making program in the federal government that I believe President Obama created. So I don't know necessarily what their strategies were as far as retraining. I think, if we want to point to an example of how to do this right, I think, Newark, New Jersey is probably an idea of how to do this right. And they fired everyone and started over again. They fired a new police chief came in, they fired everyone and then hired on new police officers with new training. And then we see in the recent protests after the George Floyd killing, we see police all over the country that are squaring off with protesters. Newark police were marching with them. So I think, I don't really know how effective the task force for 21st century policing was, but I think that's one example we could look to as far as ways to fix this.
Dr. Lawson, let me chime in here. We've got several questions from our viewers here. Maria Morales asks, why are racial and social questions not asked in different scenarios when a polygraph is done to address the biases during the hiring process? I'm assuming she's referring to the application process and the required polygraph that goes on for police applicants. There's various questions that are asked for them. I am not sure what goes into the polygraph questions, but I guess Maria is suggesting why aren't race and social questions asked in there?
I'm not sure that lots of police departments do a polygraph for prospective police officer candidates. I imagine the vast majority of them probably do background checks and criminal background checks and such. I don't know that many of them do a polygraph. I believe if you're going federal, like FBI, then there's a polygraph involved. But I don't know that local police would be doing polygraph exams just for someone they're planning to hire as a police officer. That does actually, it opens up an opportunity to talk about a project I wanted to do before I left academia, and that was I really wanted to visit different police departments all over the country and take just a sample of police officers and have them take Harvard's implicit bias test, just to see what happened. I don't know if it ever would have gone anywhere, but it's something that I thought if I could get a grant to conduct this kind of research, it would yield some interesting results. I obviously never got a chance to do it, so I can't really tell you about what would have happened. But I think that's something that would have been really interesting to do.
Can you tell for our viewers that don't know what the Harvard implicit bias test is?
Sure. It's been a while since I took it myself, but it's a free test. You can go online. I mean, probably just Google Harvard implicit bias test. And it sort of it shows you a pictures, like two pictures, and words, and it shows you pictures and words and asks you to kind of connect them just in split second timing. Like, you see a face of one racial group, and then you see some words that are basically connote good or bad, is what it gets at, and you click just like your first thought. It's rapid fire kind of thing, because the test makers don't want you consciously thinking about how should I answer this question. They want your gut reaction, because that's where implicit bias comes from. Really interesting test. You should go take it. Everyone watching should go take it and learn something about themselves.
Well, yeah, I definitely suggest taking it. It's been a few years since I've taken it myself, but we'll put a link on it after to our social media so you guys can take a stab at it. I've got another question here from Preston Riley. What is your suggestion, Dr. Lawson, for training officers to switch their mindset from the warrior mentality back to a community servant?
I would suggest reading Seth Stoughton's article called Principled Policing. It's Principled Policing, Warrior Cops and Guardian Officers, I think is the full title of it. It's in a law review. And if you don't have it, I'm sure we could get it for you, or I could. But it's about shifting that mindset from warrior fighting on the front lines, be afraid of everything, to you are here to serve a community and to serve the public here. And that's going to require you to be in danger sometimes, but not all the time, and not everyone's trying to kill you. So for specifics as far as training methods, I would suggest reading his work, as he can probably explain some of that stuff better than I can.
Dr. Lawson, we've had different guests on here, experts. I'll reference Dr. Vitale, who was on here a few weeks ago. And his stance, if I'm quoting him correctly, or at least paraphrasing him correctly, is that he doesn't believe, or is of the mindset that it may not be possible to really change the mindset of police currently, because of their role in society. I think he stated in our conversation that police are violence workers. So trying to force them, as we do sometimes, in community policing tactics, different community involvement things may not ever be possible because of what their role is. What do you think about that?
I think that sort of speaks to the defund police movement, and specifically how it points out that we do ask police officers to do things that they really aren't trained to do. We expect them to be social workers, and we expect them to be teachers, and we expect them to be psychiatrists, and we expect them to do all sorts of things that they haven't been trained to do, and they're really not supposed to be doing, but there's no one else to do it. So I think in a way he has a point, because as long as we're expecting police officers to be in situations that they have not gotten the proper training to address, that it's probably going to be a difficult hill to climb in getting any kind of change. But I would disagree with the idea that any kind of change is impossible. I mean, I'll get on my soapbox here a little bit. I'm a poor kid from rural upstate South Carolina, a little town called Buffalo in Union County that none of you have ever heard of. My dad dropped out of high school. I dropped out of school in 8th grade. My mom had a high school diploma. I'm a PhD. So when someone tells me something's not possible, no, I'm not really into hearing that something like this isn't possible, especially when we haven't actually tried yet.
So, quick question. What is your opinion? I mean, of course, the George Floyd murder is definitely, a a movement, a moment in our history that would never be forgotten. And as we face it around the nation, you know, plenty of people are in the opinion of when you talk about training, you can train an officer, but we're dealing with people because the officer in question who murdered George Floyd was said to be a training officer, actually training the officers who were there. So, you know, in my opinion, and I just want to ask you what your thoughts on that are, is because, you know, he's actually a training officer. So, you know, to me, it was more of who he was as a person and less of, you know, his training. You know what I mean? And how do we? What is your opinion on that? And
So that sort of speaks to the problem of police training, because when you're becoming a police officer, you'll go through some sort of police academy that varies likely depending on the jurisdiction you're in or the state you're in. But that's where you get sort of the classroom training, the basics. And then once you finish in the academy, you get paired with a field training officer. And this is a veteran police officer that's charged with training you how they actually do the job. Okay, you've gotten the book learning in the classroom in the police academy. Now we're going to show you on the street how we actually do this job. And I think that process is a big part of where this police culture comes from. Of you know, we're going to take care of our own, whether they do wrong or not, and this militarized mindset, it gets passed down from police generation to police generation through this training process, because that's you know, we call this in public administration studies, we call this an organizational culture, right? Police have a very strong, very tight organizational culture, and it gets passed down through this training process where they get paired with veteran officers to train. Really, someone like that probably shouldn't be training new officers and probably shouldn't necessarily be a police officer. Someone, I believe, with prior excessive force complaints, and certainly someone who has now killed a person under at best questionable circumstances, and most likely in what was a murder. So I think that really speaks to the problem of training in the process, and I think the solution to that is really just to get rid of the people who have that mindset that cannot be retrained.
How do we vet those people out?
That's a really good question. I think personality tests would be part of it. I think if every police department adopted the Harvard implicit bias test as a part of its hiring process, that would probably at least teach police leaders something about the people that they're hiring. I think psychological profiles. I think accountability, because you can hire someone who doesn't need to be a police officer, but then if you let them continue being a police officer after seeing evidence that they should not be, then the problem is now on leadership and not on the officers themselves, right? And that goes for any job. No, if you get hired in any job, if you're a professor and you have no business being a professor, you're not going to be a professor for very long, because there is a vetting process of professors before they can get tenure, to where the faculty around them and their leadership get to say, okay, you don't need to be a professor. And it's like that in most jobs, right? You have performance reviews and you have probationary periods, and if you're not a good fit for the job, you don't keep the job. And so I think with policing, we should have a similar kind of thing where there are performance reviews and there are records kept and they're actually acted on. So we don't have police officers that have multiple accusations of excessive force, or have multiple questionable incidents, or have multiple shootings that are not completely justified. And we do away with allowing police officers who are caught doing something wrong on the job, allowing them to resign so that they can go work for another police department somewhere else, because there are departments that have reputations for hiring officers that left other police departments under less than ideal circumstances, shall we say. And so I think accountability becomes a really important factor, and we should be holding our leaders accountable for that too, both in, police leaders and political leaders.
Dr. Lawson, this for some reason came into my mind the issue of the death penalty, right? We have the death penalty in South Carolina, and we have also had exonerations in South Carolina, in other states. You know, people hear about the Innocence Project, and how, you know, despite having all these constitutional rights and procedural rights and checks and appeals throughout the court process, to try and check for any flaws in the system, it's inevitable that it's not going to catch everything. So a lot of proponents for getting rid of the death penalty cite these exonerations, saying that if there's a chance that even one person will be executed, that, you know, assuming that you do believe that the death penalty is just, the chance that one innocent person could be executed, then that alone is a reason to remove the death penalty. And it almost makes me think of that with police officers, despite whatever types of training we may do. Implicit bias trainings, or like Maria was suggesting, polygraphs that have, you know, racial and social questions associated with it. It is inevitable that we will not catch everyone, right? Because our technology is not advanced enough. We are not psychics. We cannot completely be sure that we are going to be able to catch everyone that might be racist, someone that might be reckless, have anger issues. And accordingly, maybe people might suggest, well, if it's impossible for us to do that, and there's always going to be bad people that slip through the cracks into this career, then perhaps we should remove weaponry and remove the possibility of citizens getting unjustly hurt at the hands of police. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, accountability, and there's just not a lot of it going around in policing yet. And, you know, you're exactly right that, you know, no matter what kind of, unless we develop some kind of machine that can read someone's mind in real time, we're not gonna weed out, you know, even with polygraphs, which polygraphs for prospective police officers probably would be a good idea. Personality tests, implicit bias tests, background checks, any kind of, whatever layers we can think of, whatever hoops we can think of that aspiring police officers would have to jump through to get this job. You know, regular certification requirements, licensing requirements like nurses have to go through. Whatever we can think of, we're not going to catch everyone before they actually get the job and get the badge. So I think it is important to also, not just on the front end, but also on the back end, to be able to post hoc weeding out of people that are not fit to be police officers, that maybe they're racist, maybe they're reckless, maybe they have anger issues, maybe they took the job because they like having power over people and like to exploit that. You know, other professions, if we have people who just like exploiting power over people, we tend to get rid of them once that's discovered. And so I would like to see some kind of process, some kind of method of accountability that body cameras could play a role in, or other policies similar to that could play a role in weeding out whenever it's discovered that someone shouldn't be a police officer.
And I just wanted to add on that note, you know, for those who slip through the cracks, and then there's that other small group that are allowed to come through the cracks. You know, for instance, the gentleman who was involved with, again, George Floyd's murder, it's documented that he had complaints against him previously about, you know, his policing practices. And even if you go to Georgia, to the Arbery case, even though he was a former law enforcement, the time frame that it took to get him, to get that case, you know, actually to get a sense of justice where there was an arrest, was delayed because of someone who sat in the seat who was still a friend of this gentleman and allowed him, you know what I mean, in that situation to go on without question for so long. So yeah, you will have those who are slip through the crack, and then you will have another group of people who are allowed to go through the crack. So what that does is it just brings me to a realization, and I hope everybody else, that racial bias is not just in law enforcement. It's a system that's been designed, and it's definitely a buddy thing. You all the way around the board. And, that just makes it more harder. But I think the most important thing is the community engagement, that where community is aware of the process, and they get to be allowed at the table to have these discussions and, an open dialogue. So, yeah, it's one of those things, you know what I mean? When when you want to talk about, those who slip through the cracks and getting through the training, but those who are allowed to come through the cracks knowing, you know what I mean, that they're not fit for that job.
So I actually think that leads in both points about body camera and general accountability into the prosecutors. What do you feel the prosecutor's role is in this function? Because as a defense attorney, when I get body cam, of an officer behaving in a questionable manner, I go back to my prosecutor, and of course we have, our chief prosecutor or solicitor here in Charleston. They're generally tasked with, egregious cases, like the Slater case, of prosecuting. How do you feel like they work in terms of a check on the police officers?
So this isn't something that I've actually studied myself. But I mean, if you think about sort of the interrelation of these different institutions, prosecutors don't really have an incentive to hold police accountable. And what I mean when I say that is, first, police and prosecutors have to work together. They have to get along, and they have to have some level of trust with each other, right? And I'm not an attorney, so if I'm wrong about this, feel free to let me know. But it seems like there has to be some level of trust involved between these two entities, the police and prosecutors, so that the police can bring cases to the prosecutors, and prosecutors can trust that these cases are cases that they should be spending their time and resources on, and police need to be able to trust that prosecutors will be spending the time and resources on the cases that they bring. So just because of that necessary element of trust there, that's one incentive for prosecutors to not necessarily hold police accountable, because if a prosecutor prosecutes a police officer for any kind of misconduct, the police, because of that tight organizational culture, they might take offense to that. They might see that as sort of a violation of that trust. More beyond that, most prosecutors are, or at least the chief prosecutors, the solicitors and such, they're elected positions. And so just thinking as a political scientist, if I'm running for office and I'm a sitting solicitor and I'm running for reelection, do I want to have an opponent that's going to be able to say he prosecuted police officers? Unless it's a really egregious, George Floyd level of wrongdoing, I don't really want to put that on myself, because that's handing my political opponents ammunition they could use against me. And so it's two incentives I can think of there, to where, prosecutors wouldn't want to necessarily hold police accountable. It's like I tell my students when I'm teaching American government and we're talking about budgets and the defense budget and how it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it really is not cut very often. I ask, do you want to be the politician that lets their opponent accuse them of cutting funding for soldiers? No, of course not. Do you want to be the politician that tried to cut Social Security and has to go tell, voters that are 65 and older who vote in relatively high proportions that you tried to cut their income? No, of course you don't. And if you're a prosecutor, do you want to be the prosecutor that has to go and defend to your constituents and explain why you prosecuted a police officer who, as we've discussed already, they believe can do no wrong? I don't think so.
See, and I think that raises another issue, and maybe, honestly, I think it still falls within the criminal justice system as it is, having prosecutors who are elected. Do you believe that that's an appropriate way for our system to work?
We elect entirely too many things in this country, and especially in this state. We elect the governor, we elect most of the cabinet, we elect the superintendent of education. Up until recently, we elected the lieutenant governor separately from the governor. I'm really not sure why we did that. The adjutant general of the National Guard used to be elected. So the leader of the state National Guard used to be elected. We elect coroners, and we elect city council and county council and mayors and state house and state senate and solicitors. And I have a PhD in political science. candidates, and there is no possible way for me to know about every candidate on the ballot every time I go vote. It's just like, I have kids, right? It's not possible. You know, me as someone who dedicated a large portion of my life to studying this stuff, and who you would think would have a fairly easy time researching these things. I can't do it. So a regular person, you know, football season's going to start hopefully in a few months. Other people have kids. They have jobs that don't involve politics, don't involve government and elections. They have other things taking their perspective away. So I think just in general, we elect entirely too many things in this country. I don't know necessarily what a better option would be, especially for lower level offices like that don't really get a lot of turnout in those elections. You can't even make the argument that they're representing the geographic area they're elected to represent, because such a small proportion of people actually vote in those elections. So I think it might be just a better case if it was something more similar to the federal system, where we elect the president and then the president appoints U.S. attorneys to be prosecutors, or some system like that. You know, we elect the governor, let the governor appoint solicitors, or we elect county councils and let them choose solicitors. But I think maybe making it an appointed position with elected officials that are a little more visible, that we could then hold accountable if they make decisions that we don't like, I think that probably is a little bit better of an option.
You know, there are a lot of positions that are not elected and that are appointed, as you mentioned, you know, federal positions. But there's also a lot of, you know, problems with that, as people have pointed out, that by taking away the election process for the general public, you're putting the decision in the hands of a few, and sometimes one, which lends itself to potential corruption, political favors, political reasons for appointing people, which won't necessarily prevent, you know, the wrong people from being appointed as well. But I agree. I mean, what is the best system? To leave it in the hands of all, despite maybe a good amount of people, maybe the majority, not necessarily wanting to educate themselves on those positions, or putting them in the hands of a few, who those few are actually elected as well. You know, I don't really know the answer, but I appreciate your point on that. I have a question here from one of our viewers. Dr. Lawson, what do you think about the use of ex-military personnel in policing? So veterans becoming police officers, does that better the level of training for those officers, or is it a bad thing to have ex-military or veterans becoming police officers?
So when I was working on the Political Research Quarterly article on militarization and how it affects lethal force, one of the variables I might have put this in the appendix for the article, I don't remember, but one of the models I ran was just an indicator for whether a police department allowed military service as a substitute for educational requirements. So in other words, if a police department requires a bachelor's degree, but you were in the Army and you don't have a bachelor's degree, but you have Army service experience, they would accept the Army service experience as a replacement for education. So I used that as sort of an alternative measure to what I used, which was 1033 program equipment. I used that as kind of an alternative measure of militarization. And I actually didn't find a relationship between that and killings. So I'm not opposed to military veterans becoming police officers or any other profession. I think it does potentially raise some of those psychological issues, maybe, because someone who has literally been fighting on the front lines, surrounded by an enemy that they don't necessarily know who's friendly and who's enemy, to then become police officers, I think there might potentially be problems there. I have not seen any research or done any research examining whether military veterans in police departments lead to more militarization or to more effects of militarization like killings. I'm not sure. I could see potentially a problem from that, but on its face, no. If other mechanisms are in place to screen prospective candidates and to hold them accountable once they're hired, I don't see that really as a problem.
What is the the largest factor that correlates to killings when it comes to police?
So if I'm thinking back, population of the jurisdiction the police department's over had a positive effect, which makes sense because if there's more people within a department's jurisdiction, they're probably going to kill more people, just all else equal. So militarization, which I use as the dollar value of military equipment that from the 1033 program that the police department had on hand. And we can talk about 1033 later. That's a fun conversation topic. So that had a positive effect. Racial demographics, I believe, actually did not have an effect on killings. But my prior chapter in the dissertation finds that racial demographics actually influence militarization. So that would explain why I wouldn't see a direct effect between race and killings. Yeah, I think that was about it. Poverty, I believe, might have had a positive association. But I remember, I think the biggest effect, I think population was the biggest effect, and that kind of makes sense.
When you say positive correlation, can you explain what you mean when you say that?
Sure. When one goes up, the other goes up. That's a positive association. So population goes up, killings go up. Militarization goes up, killings go up.
So if there's a larger indigent population or poor people in a community, then that can also be associated with more killings. Is that what you found?
Yes.
There's an argument that, partial militarization of our police is a good thing. For example, the implementation of tactical teams like SWAT, generally, when it comes to like bank robberies and things like that, using teams like that are a boon, a benefit for police officers because those subsections within the department are trained at a higher level to deal with more complicated issues. Do you think there are positive effects of militarization, or do you think just in general it's a negative thing?
So when I say militarization, I refer specifically to the psychological process that I discussed of militarization, and I can go into more detail about how I think that process works. But I don't. When I say other people say militarization, they think of body armor and assault weapons and grenade launchers and tanks and such. And I think militarization comes first, and then all that other stuff follows once they become militarized. So when I talk about militarization, I wouldn't necessarily argue, although some have made this argument. Peter Kraska, a criminologist, for example, it looks at the proliferation of SWAT teams in one article as militarization. So he argues that as more police departments around the country create SWAT teams, that means those police are becoming more militarized. I say maybe, but I see militarization as more of a psychological process rather than just equipment or teams or tactics or anything like that. But to answer the question, SWAT teams, as they were initially intended, it makes sense. They were initially invented, major cities like Los Angeles and New York, to be specifically use of force specialists. So these are police officers, either they are full-time SWAT team members or they're part-time and they're full-time police officers, but they're only in the SWAT team when they need to be. But the idea was for situations like barricaded suspects, hostage situations, terrorist attacks, things like that, where you need a team of highly trained, basically police special forces to go into a difficult situation that regular police maybe aren't equipped for or aren't trained for. Within that context, I think SWAT teams make perfect sense. Where I think it went wrong is that SWAT teams are not really used for that anymore. And I believe it might have been Jonathan Momolo who did a study on SWAT team deployments, but someone has done something on SWAT team deployments recently. I think it was Jonathan Momolo at Princeton. But the SWAT teams are being used in search warrants. They're being, there used to be a show on called Dallas SWAT, where it would follow SWAT team members in the Dallas Police Department. And so they would follow this SWAT team and just, what they do in their downtime, when they're training, practicing, and then when they're actually going to operations, they're conducting search warrants. which is not what SWAT teams were initially designed to do. There are some police departments that actually patrol with SWAT teams. They'll put them into an MRAP, which is a mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle, military vehicle invented for the Iraq War. Police department has an MRAP, and they would have their SWAT team patrol in the street in an MRAP. So SWAT teams is initially designed. Yeah, I think there's lots of benefits, and there's situations that they are needed, but they're also being used now. It's sort of like, well, we have this. Let's just see what else we can use it for. And they're being used for things that they really were not intended and have not necessarily been trained.
And actually, I think that ties in nicely with the Breonna Taylor murder. How do you feel like, because as you just said, SWAT teams are being used now to execute search warrants, and in that situation, that's pretty much what happened with her. How do we address issues like that?
It was a no-knock search warrant where they send the SWAT team in and they just kick the door in, and run in, guns up. I think one solution to that, and some might not like this, would be to ban no-knock search warrants, because really, I mean, we're in South Carolina. This is a state that loves guns. We have a lot of gun owners in this state, and so what happens when a SWAT team kicks in someone's door and wakes someone up like they did with Breonna Taylor, and that person is a gun owner and they think it's someone robbing them because they didn't knock. They might have announced that they were police, but I mean, if someone kicks my door in, the first thing I'm thinking is someone just kicked my door in, not, oh, well, they said they're police, so it's okay. And it's at night, she's asleep. Police kick the door in without knocking. They probably announced police or SWAT or something like that. I don't know, but they probably did. But I think that's exactly this kind of situation that I'm talking about, with SWAT teams being used for situations that they're not really intended for.
I think, Allie, you're muted.
Keith, you're on mute there too. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah, Dr. Lawson, I have a question from one of the viewers. The question states, isn't the big difference that there is a chain of command in the military and tons of discretion is allowed to individual police officers? How can police become militarized given their major differences?
That is true. There's a lot. Police officers get a lot of discretion. Oftentimes, they're working by themselves. They're in the car by themselves. Maybe they have a partner, maybe not. But there is a lot of discretion, and they don't have any real direct supervision, like you would have in a situation like the military. But it comes back to that training process and that socialization process, and that the installation of the organizational culture when they are coming through police academy and coming through their field training, which they spend a lot of time on, and they're interacting with other officers even if they're out in the field by themselves. And so it still comes from the training part. There's lots of time for socialization, and not as in socializing, but as in teaching. This is the way we do things. This is the way we think. Organizational culture type stuff. There's still plenty of opportunity for that.
I think a major issue that we're going to have to face, though, is, as you said, socialization, and the time that's going to take to deal with the biases that, let's say we're just going to focus on the police, even though we know as a nation, by and large, we all have our biases. How do we account for this unknown time frame in dealing with this issue?
It's not an easy process. You're right in that, and it's something that will take time and effort, and probably some failure along the way and some setbacks. But I think I don't think it's a valid argument to say that, well, this is going to be difficult, so we shouldn't even try. I really refuse to accept that as an argument. If I took that, I'd still be living in the upstate. I wouldn't have a PhD. I wouldn't have done this research on policing. I wouldn't have 2 kids, because raising kids is difficult. So why even do it? So I don't really accept that as a response, that it's just too difficult and it's going to take time. Of course, it's going to take time. Everything worth doing is difficult and takes time.
But Dr. Lawson, here we're dealing with, not just, childhood and disadvantages, but generations, cultural you know, the foundation of our country was founded on slavery and racism. We're not just dealing with, you know, individuals, but the culture that surrounds it. I think we can tell by the fact that there are still monuments, thousands of them all over the country, that are now just finally being asked to be removed. Is it too much to ask for us to expect to end racism in such a short period of time, maybe a few years? I guess what I'm saying is, you know, I'll reference my old boss in South Florida and West Palm Beach, Carrie Howitt, the head public defender there. She was a fantastic trial attorney. And down in Florida, which we don't have here, which is one thing we're advocating for, is attorney-led voir dire, which means that the lawyers get to ask prospective jurors questions and get a lot of time to do that, to find out what kind of biases they may have for the defendant, whether it comes to race or maybe their experiences or things like that. And as new lawyers, a lot of us assume, well, I don't want someone that is racist to be on my jury. I certainly don't want someone like that. But her take on it, which I thought was really interesting, was that she doesn't necessarily not want the juror that's racist. She'd rather have, let's say she asked, you know, a question like, do you have a bias towards African Americans? And she gets, you know, 3 people. One says yes, the other says no, of course not, and the third says yes, and I guess that's wrong. You know, she wants that third person that recognizes and accepts the fact that they may be biased, they may be racist, but is able to recognize that so that they can change. If we had trainings or implicit bias screenings or polygraphs, is it that we don't want people that may be biased, may be racist, or do we want the people that accept that because most of us are implicitly biased and are willing to work towards that change?
So I didn't know we didn't have that in South Carolina. That's interesting to know. I've never had jury duty, so I've never had the experience. I think that's a good point, and I don't think anyone can reasonably expect to eliminate racism. I think a more plausible goal would be to eliminate the negative effects of racism. And so what I mean by that is, you know, you might have a racist police officer, but I want that racist police officer terrified to act on that racism. Right? Or you might have a racist public school teacher. I want that teacher terrified to act on that racism, because if they do, I want them to be caught and properly sanctioned and punished for the effects of the racism, not for having racist beliefs themselves. Because again, until we get that machine that can read people's minds, we're never going to know what is in someone's head unless they act on it. And I think it's the acting on it that we should really be focusing on, and not necessarily the beliefs themselves. And you know, those extra hoops to make police officers jump through, to the extent that we eventually ever implement them. I think that should be the end goal, is you know, not necessarily to refuse to hire someone because they showed they have some implicit biases, but to compare those results with others, with interviews, with background checks, with other psychological profile type mechanisms, to see, well, okay, everyone has implicit biases, but how likely do we think this person is to act on those biases in a negative way? I think that's really what we need to get at. So in that situation, the juror that says yes, I wouldn't want them on my jury. The juror that says yes, and I guess that's wrong, I would think that juror would lead to fewer negative consequences as a result of those biases later on.
We have another question from somebody who's watching. Do you think the militarized psychology of these officers translates into the paradox that power inherently invites the challenge of the power given to SWAT teams?
Can you say that one more time? Just make sure I got it.
Do you think the militarized psychology of these officers translates into the paradox that power inherently invites the challenge of the power given to SWAT teams?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think they're saying that this militarized mindset that they have, it translates into, or this questionable translation into, should they really have the power that they're given? For example, when it comes to SWAT teams, I think that's how I'm reading it.
Okay. So like an absolute power corrupts absolutely kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's the reason for training and the reason for accountability. Because maybe we don't want them to have absolute power, but the fact remains that police do a job that someone has to do. Though professional policing itself is relatively new, but someone has to do the things that police are supposed to do, and so we collectively give that power to this institution called police, but we also should have the power to oversee the use of the power that we give them and to hold them accountable if they misuse that power.
I think a perspective from a viewer kind of walks that same line. One of the viewers, her perspective is that you might not change the people, but you can focus on the policies and procedures that uphold the racism. And if the policies and procedures don't cultivate racism, then the people who believe racist thoughts can't be as dangerous. So I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective because I understand, the need for better training, but being able to weed them out when you have policies and procedures that, kind of make it okay, in a sense, are friendly, with the racist officers, law enforcement officers that patrol these communities. I think you would take the power out of the racist officers, whether you train them right or wrong, if the policies and procedures were in place, or weren't in place that gave them the power and made them as dangerous as they are in that position. So.
Sure. A big part of the reason that racism is so detrimental is that it is structural, and it's systemic, and it's built in to so many of our political systems and our institutions. And so that is one way to weaken it is to cripple the institutional power. And so then the individual power or the individual prejudice would not be quite so. What's the word I'm looking for? It wouldn't be quite so detrimental without that structural power.
Keith, that's a really interesting point. Our viewer that made that, it kind of makes me want to pivot back again in terms of like policies when it comes to body camera footage. You talk a lot about accountability. I mean, in our government is set up in a way that it has inherent accountability. That's why we have the 3 branches of government, right? We have checks for each branch of government that doesn't necessarily have absolute power over any other branch. The problem is when it comes to everyday policing, especially before body cameras, a lot of times it was just the police officer and the person that was under arrest or being investigated.
Or dead.
And there may not be any witnesses there. And even if there are, a lot of times the police officer is held to a higher standard and believed automatically just because of their role as an officer. But body cameras kind of tie in this different accountability, and the same as we see with George Floyd and in recent years, Walter Scott, with the power of the individual to have this technology to monitor and preserve the evidence that may not have been preserved because we have cell phones, we have cameras now. But still, there's not always going to be people there with a cell phone, right? The person that's being arrested may not be permitted, and many times is not permitted, to film an arrest or to film an officer or touch their pockets or their purse to get it out. Which brings it to the policies of when is an officer supposed to use their body camera? Are they supposed to have a body camera? One thing that I learned when I moved to South Carolina from Florida was that after the Walter Scott killing that happened in 2017, I believe, there was a push for legislative reform when it came to body cameras. And a bill was passed that required body cameras for police officers in South Carolina. But what I quickly learned was that that bill was very vague, in that while, yes, it required police agencies to provide body cameras, it did not, it allowed that agency to create its own policies about who used the body camera and when it was used. So again, we have issues from agency to agency about when they are to be accountable at all. But an interesting thing I learned when I started in private practice is that there are some charges that require body camera footage in order to continue with the charge, specifically DUIs. And my understanding is because a lot of DUI attorneys throughout the state pushed for legislative reform to require body camera footage for certain stops of DUIs. And there are administrative hearings that if there is no footage that records this initial stop of the vehicle, then that case must be thrown out. What do you think about that being extended to all circumstances? That if the body camera does not record the interaction, the entire interaction of the police and arrested defendant interaction and any alleged events, then that should be thrown out.
I think we should. I think anytime a police officer thinks they are about to engage in some kind of enforcement activity, or really, you might could say anytime they're interacting with a civilian, but these things have limited battery life, 4 to 6 hours or something like that sometimes, depending on the camera. So for a full shift, they might run out of juice. But especially anytime the officer believes they're about to engage in any kind of enforcement action, they pulled someone over, they get dispatched to some kind of incident, anything like that where they're acting. They're not just standing around talking to somebody, right? Like taking a break, ordering a coffee at Starbucks, they shouldn't have to turn the body camera on for that because they're interacting with someone. But if they get called to the Starbucks because someone's just creating a disturbance, then yes, they should have the camera on then. But anyway, that's just to say anytime they're engaging in what might be an enforcement action, they should be required to turn those cameras on. If they charge anyone, those charges should be thrown out if there's no footage to corroborate it. I would go beyond that and say that if a police officer knowingly turns off their body camera when it should be on, that officer should be terminated, period. It shouldn't even be, there should be no, it should be zero tolerance for it. You turn the camera off when it's supposed to be on, you're gone.
So a quick question I want to ask your opinion on the Breonna Taylor situation with the no-knock warrants. Of course, the officers were fired, and within that, that means that there was some wrongdoing done. And even Louisville has rescinded the no-knock policy. But what is your opinion on the how would I say, the lack of arrest of these officers? Just simple as put as that. What is your opinion on that? Because and I'll just leave that question that's right there. I just want to know your opinion on it.
Well, in some cases, it's just the laws make it so difficult to prosecute a police officer for something like that often it probably isn't even worth the resources to try to prosecute them as much as we would like to see it done. And I would like to see it done in that situation. There's also the issue of, you're pulling a jury from the general public who hold police officers on this pedestal where they think they can generally do no wrong. So it's going to be an uphill fight from a prosecution standpoint. So even leaving out any kind of potential conscious attempts to try to protect the police officers just by firing them and hoping it goes away, which I don't know if it's happening in that situation. I'm saying it could in a situation that's similar to that. I think even leaving that aside, just again the institutional design around prosecuting police officers is difficult. and so it might not even be worth trying to prosecute them. You may have situations where prosecutors do prosecute the police, but they kind of phone it in and don't really want to prosecute, or they consciously choose not to prosecute. But even again, setting aside any kind of malevolence it's difficult to do under the best circumstances, even with cell phone video and body camera and all that. It's just difficult to prosecute and get a conviction, from my understanding.
Yeah, another reason why it's always important to go to jury duty. That's one of my things, if I could get anyone to take away. And most people that do go to jury duty and serve on a jury usually have a very good experience and come away very happy about it. So it is not just your duty, but it is really, really important.
I've never been summoned, and I'm mad about that.
I'm not saying I have been summoned. I'll probably never get to serve on a jury now that I've been an attorney for this long, especially criminal defense. But I always cross my fingers every time it happens. Tola, have you ever gotten to be on a jury? You're on mute, Tola.
No, and I was saying the same thing. And I've had discussions with my brother who's been on juries, and he, vaguely is fascinated by the facts of it. And I think, I'd love to see it from that perspective. And I wish more people were aware, of the role that you play when you're on a jury, because you're part of doling out justice, So I think when the judge says it's an honor, it truly is. So I haven't, but I would love to be.
It also is interesting, and Keith, maybe you can chime in on this, about the disparity that happens with jurors, right? There are certain things that can prevent you from being on a jury, or even if you are called to jury duty, pretty much are automatic dismissals. They always ask if you have been convicted of a felony. That can be considered an automatic strike at times. People that are currently on probation or have a pending case. Sometimes people that have spent significant time in prison, or people that, aren't either registered to vote. If you're in a state that's based on voter registry, or you're in a state based on driver's license, that can kind of limit the types of people that go in there. Also, location wise, you might, for example, we're in Charleston, the courthouse is in downtown Charleston. If you live far away and you do not have a transportation to get there, that's going to limit the amount of people, certain types of people that are going to be there for your jury of your peers.
Yeah, and that, I guess that severely hinders the process. When you say a jury of your peers, that's so far from the truth. When for the most part, statistically, you look at the African American disparities are the majority of the African Americans that come through the judicial system and through that process of trial. They very seldom do they ever look at a jury of their peers, and it's for that reason, or among other reasons. But it's definitely that does he have a criminal record? In these, and it's almost like these questions are pointing, specifically for that reason, to wean those people out, so that the jury won't be balanced, so that it would be imbalanced. And that is definitely a part of the racial injustice that we face for years, for decades. We've been going through that, and was glad that people are finally taking notice, and we're trying to figure out a way to to kind of balance the playing field, although that we will never be able to even it, but because we're so far behind the 8 ball with this situation. But
Keith, and I'm sorry I'm going off topic here, but I'm just curious. I know, so Keith was in episode 1 of our Justice Unveiled series, which is a different series where we interview different players in the criminal justice system. In his episode, he talked about his experience through the criminal justice system, which include, to preface shortly, that he did have a trial for a drug trafficking charge. He was not at the trial because he was tried in his absence, which is another thing that is really messed up that we're hoping to change here. But my question to you, Keith, did you ever find out what the racial makeup was of your jury that found you guilty?
I didn't. I have the paperwork. I can easily look at it. For me, I think, why that, those situations are case by case situations. for me, I think, I was in a situation where there was an actual conflict of interest between me and my attorney. So therefore, he went upon himself and tried me in my absence. So, you know, would that conviction have been different had the jury been actually, even though, like I said, I don't know, the numbers. I didn't even look at that. I just knew that I had 29 years, was convicted and, sentenced to 29 years in my absentia. So, you know what I mean? Ali, that's just one of those things where, those relationships, when you get in that situation and, when you don't know, what you feel like you should know, even under that circumstances, and you trust and believe in the system. And even if you don't consider your attorney a part of the system because you paid them and you expect them to work for you, but in reality, they are a officer of the court. And, so yeah, my situation was one of those situations where, with so many question marks and so many different, ups and downs, a lot of bad things that happened in that case. And I never looked at the disparities in the jury pool.
Yeah, well, I mean, I keep saying I would love to, and Tola, I wonder if you'd probably be interested, if Keith's okay with it, in doing a deep dive into Keith's case and really finding out what went down. We've talked a lot about starting a podcast soon, and I still am telling Keith I would love to do a series about his experience, to walk through each step and really dive into that. But that's for another time.
I'll listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's Keith's story, and I really suggest you guys check out on our website on sc4cjr.org. That's SC and the number 4 CJR.org. Under videos, our first episode of Justice Unveiled. It was Keith and I, our first episode, and we really went into the details of what happened to Keith. But there's even more to that that we're hoping to share with you all, because his situation is very unique. So we'll get into that another time, but we're so grateful for Keith. We're also so grateful for Dr. Lawson. This was so informative. I feel like I could keep going on this, but I know we're already going over. Do we have any more questions from Tola or Keith that you wanted to get into with Dr. Lawson?
Not at the moment.
I would actually like you to, if you can briefly before we go, to talk a little bit about the 1033 program. I know you said you would do that, but I'm very interested in it. Okay.
Sure. So 1033 is a program that Congress created in the 90s. It is a program that allows any law enforcement agency in the country, federal, state, county, city, whatever, any of them that have at least one sworn officer, to request and receive surplus military equipment from the federal government, from the U.S. military. And this is stuff that each state has a coordinator for the 1033 program, and so police departments will go through that coordinator to apply to get access. And so what happens is, all this military equipment that's not being used is just sitting in warehouses all over the country, just collecting dust, not doing anything. There's stuff that is brand new, never been used before, but Congress bought it in the federal budget, so it's sitting there doing nothing. And so stuff's just sitting there, and these police departments get access to this program, and they can either go to a warehouse in person, or they can browse a website that shows an inventory of all the equipment that the program has on hand, and they can request it, and they receive it, and they only pay for shipping. So it's kind of like backwards Amazon Prime. They get the item for free, but they have to pay for the shipping. Right, the reverse of Amazon Prime. So they get this equipment. If they're only paying for transport for an MRAP is pricey because it's a giant vehicle, but the vehicle itself costs more than $500,000, and so they're getting that for free, but they're paying, I don't know what it costs to transport, 10-20 grand, something like that, whatever it costs to drive the thing to where they are on a truck. And then they just get to use it. And so certain categories of equipment and the stuff gets demilitarized. So if they get an M16 rifle, it cannot fire in fully automatic. It only fires in single shot. And so they take the machine guns off the Humvees and the MRAPs. But they get this equipment. Certain categories of equipment remains federal property forever. So that would be things like weapons, like guns, vehicles, any kind of vehicle, that stuff remains federal property in perpetuity. Anything else, though, and they can get other stuff besides that, like clothing, night vision goggles, medical supplies, boots, body armor, stuff like that. It becomes it becomes the property of the receiving police department once they've had it for a year. So when they've had it for a year, it becomes their property. It's like they got it just paying for shipping. And so the Defense Logistics Agency within the Defense Department at the federal level, it keeps an inventory of what police departments have on hand, and it updates it every quarter. So every quarter there's a new spreadsheet, and you can get this online now, thanks to people like me who filed lots of Freedom of Information Act requests requesting records of this stuff. They now put the quarterly inventory for each quarter online. Historical ones, you still got to FOIA them for, but the current ones are still online. You can go download and you can see what each police department has. And I think they actually have transfer records now. They have some more stuff they've put up since I was researching this program. So each quarter they release this Excel workbook of what each agency in each state has, if it has anything. They're kind of generic terms, like an M16 will be rifle, 5.56 millimeter, or it might say helicopter, utility, or mine resistant vehicle. That's an MRAP. And it gives you the value of what it costs when Congress bought it for the first time. It tells you the date it was shipped to the police department. It tells you how many of them they have. And so that was part of my research, was getting these quarterly spreadsheets, and I requested records of all of the equipment transfers that they had going back to the beginning of this program. And I was told by DLA officials that before the fourth quarter of 2014, whenever they would update the quarterly spreadsheet, they would save the new one over the old one's file name. And so it would erase the old one by saving the new one. So before the fourth quarter of 2014, there's actually no record of what police departments had back then.
We see that sometimes with police policies and handbooks.
It's wild. I cannot believe that was actually policy. I mean, I guess nobody cared at the time, or they just didn't want to pay for the storage, because these are big files. I don't know whose idea that was, but it made me laugh as a researcher. And so some of the issues with this program, lack of oversight and accountability, which has been a common theme tonight. There was some journalists, I can't remember where they were, but there were some journalists that did an investigative piece of this program. They created a fake police department, and they applied to the 1033 program, and they got accepted, and they requested like $2 million worth of equipment.
Did you say journalists?
Yeah, reporters. Yeah, they made a fake police department. They made up fake logo, fake name, fake letterhead, applied to the 1033 program, and they got approved to join. And then they requested, I think, something like $2 million worth of equipment, including rifles, and it was approved. So there have been lots of examples of police departments. There's a police department in rural Georgia, southeast Georgia, that's gotten, I think that one's $5 million worth of equipment. They have a population of a little over 1,000 people, and some of the equipment they got was a boat and some scuba gear. The deepest body of water in their jurisdiction is a creek that sometimes gets ankle deep. So I'm not sure what the boat or the scuba gear's for. There's another police department in rural Texas that had one sworn officer that was the police chief. Got $2 or $3 million worth of stuff, including M16 rifles and such. And it turned out that police chief was selling or trading the equipment that he got from the program to other people. He actually was prosecuted for that, which is a very rare occurrence. But there's all sorts of examples that I've come across in my research of this program of these tiny police departments getting millions of dollars worth of equipment. So my undergrad was at the University of South Carolina Upstate, which is a little regional satellite teaching school in Spartanburg, South Carolina. The USC Police Department has, I don't know if it still has them, but at one point it had M16 rifles from the 1033 program, and I'm not really sure. Like, there's barely any on-campus housing at that school, so I'm not sure what they got that for, but there's no oversight. I've actually I've seen the order form that police departments have. It's about half a page. It's the name of the agency, it's the address, a phone number, an email address, and a list of people in the agency who will have authorization to request items through the program. That's it. There's no real vetting of who gets what. There's no real, other than this quarterly spreadsheet, there's not a lot of oversight, but it could be wrong.
So what about like requirements? Do they have to state why they need it, what they need it for, how they use it every year?
I believe for certain pieces of equipment like MRAPs, there has to be sort of a justification for what they're using it for. But thanks to the war on terror, they take a pretty broad understanding of what justifies getting this stuff.
What about approval? I mean, a question from a viewer was, who's approving this stuff? What is the approval process like?
So they submit it through either the website or they go to the warehouse. I believe approval comes from, maybe it might be coming from the state coordinator, or it might come from the Defense Logistics Agency. I'm not really sure, but I have not heard of any instance where anything was denied. So I just, in all the, it might have happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying that in all my time of studying this program, I have not run into any instances where equipment was denied.
So what if an agency gets a mine-resistant vehicle, an MRAP, I think.
MRAP.
MRAP.
MRAP, MRAP. I was driving to school one day when I was still in grad school, and I'm on Broad River Road in Columbia, and I just happened to look out the side of my car, and there's an MRAP parked at the red light beside me. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning, and okay, I'm awake.
Police department on it?
I believe it was Richland County Sheriff's Office.
So we had a few episodes ago, we had a bunch of protesters that were on, Frank Knack, the ACLU executive director of South Carolina, and a lot of them testified, and well, not testified, but stated that they saw similar vehicles and tanks, as they called it, downtown Charleston during some of the protests that were going on. And a lot of them said, I didn't even know that we had these things in Charleston. I didn't know that Berkeley Sheriff's Office or, Goose Creek or whoever, all the agencies that were there had this stuff.
Now you can go to the DLA website. And I'll send you a link if you want to tweet out the link that we're to the website we're talking about. People can look up their own police departments and see what they have. Yeah,
that'd be fascinating. So one last question about that. So what if an agency does get, a bunch of this weaponry or these resources, and that those resources are still considered federal property, as you said, sometimes it can be, at least sometimes for that first year. And then after that year, they don't use it at all. Are there any consequences to that?
If they're not using it, not that I know of. I don't know. I don't know of any situation where the feds have gone, okay, you got to give us that thing back. I'm just not really sure if that's ever happened. Really, for my purposes, the distinction between stuff that becomes agency property and stuff that becomes federal property, the distinction was in how I was calculating my measure of militarization, which was the dollar value of equipment that the police department had in that quarter. I would have liked to go back farther in time, but the problem with those is that if they get something and it becomes their property, it drops off the spreadsheet. If it gets destroyed or transferred or sent back, it drops off the spreadsheet. So you can think of the spreadsheets as kind of like a snapshot of what the police department had as of the end of that quarter, rather than a temporal record of what they've had over time, because it's not.
So, wait, I'm sorry. So if they have something, it's the federal property, but then it's changed to agency, then it's not on the list, or I don't understand that.
So if police department gets an MRAP and they end up sending it to a different police department, it stays on the sheet, but it changes which department it's under. And so for my purpose, I'm trying to look at what they have over time. So, before 2014, if they had 20 MRAPs, they probably didn't. But if they had 20 MRAPs before 2014, and then now they don't have them anymore, I have no idea because it's not on the spreadsheet. So that was more for my purposes, that I was trying to get a record of what police departments had over time so I could compare it to how many people they kill over time. That was really where that mattered for me. But it's an interesting thing. So the federal property stays on the spreadsheet as long as the police department has it. Stuff that becomes the agency property drops off.
Real quick, I just wanted to share. A viewer has, I guess, posted this perspective like 3 times, so I guess he really wants this perspective to be heard, and it's a really
Okay.
good perspective, and it has something to do with my situation. And he says, in reference to my case and my situation, he said that shouldn't have happened. How can you convict a man in a court of law that's not present while having resources in place that won't convict a cop that's on video committing a hideous act? Does that have anything, I just would add, is it that one word that has become so prevalent right now in the conversation and police practices called what is it called, immunity, qualified
Qualified
immunity?
immunity.
Yeah, of course.
It could honestly, I am shocked that they convicted someone that wasn't even in the room. That blows me away. I didn't know that was legal. I didn't know that was a thing that could be done.
It happens all the time, especially in lower courts. Am I right, Tola?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, so that's what it is. I mean, how could you convict a man in court without being present, but you cannot convict a law enforcement officer for something that it's presently seen. This is on video camera. So that definitely qualified immunity is definitely a conversation into new police practicing and trying to figure out ways that we can even level the playing field when it comes to law enforcement and civilians. So
And I'm sure the attorneys could probably speak to qualified immunity better than I can.
And we actually had a whole episode on that with Professor Stout, and we had another professor from the Charleston School of Law who spoke specifically on qualified immunity. So check out our, I think it was episode 2. I don't remember total. Episode 2 to check that out and learn all about qualified immunity, which is a very complicated issue, but certainly many of us believe needs to change. But Dr. Lawson, I can't tell you how informative this was. This was fun. I learned so much. We went way over time, but I enjoyed every second of it. I can't thank you enough. Tola, Keith, thank you as always. Love you guys. We are fighting the good fight here at South Carolina for Criminal Justice Reform. Please like our page. Before this Zoom call started, we had 999 followers on our Facebook page, and I am determined to get to 1,000 by tonight. So please, someone, I should probably give a prize to the 1,000th follower, but please follow us, share us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and of course our website, www.sc4cjr.org. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you next week, Thursday at 7 o'clock. We will be hosting episode 2 of Justice Unveiled series, featuring elected solicitor, aka prosecutor for Charleston County and Berkeley County, Scarlett Wilson. She's going to be talking to us about a lot of current events that are going on and her role as a prosecutor here in the Low Country. We're looking forward to that. And I also apologize for not mentioning before, this event was also co-sponsored by the College of Charleston Department of Philosophy. We thank you so much for co-sponsoring with us. And we are so grateful to Dr. Lawson. Everyone have a wonderful night. Take care.
All right.